Hello, everybody, and welcome to Bright Founders Talk at Temi. Temi is an international software development company that designs, builds, and delivers software for sustainable businesses and promising startups. Welcome to our podcast, where we bring you the most inspiring stories of entrepreneurs and experts in the software development industry. And each week, we interview successful leaders who share their unique journeys and valuable insights. I'm your host, Barry, and today we're lucky enough to have a remarkable guest joining us, Richard White, who is founder and CEO at Fathom. Hello, Richard. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Our pleasure. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day. I know you're very busy. If you wouldn't mind telling us just a little bit about yourself and the company that you work at, please.
I am a mediocre software engineer turned maybe slightly better than mediocre product designer, turned kind of multi-time founder at this point. Fathom started about 4 years ago. It is an AI meeting assistant, or AI note taker if you prefer it. It's an app that joins your Zoom, Microsoft Teams, Google Meet meetings, and takes all the notes for you, right? Recording it, transcribing it, putting it into kind of a note format that you have some control over. It might even fill out your CRM. You might be able to, you can grab clips of it, of your meeting afterwards, share them with your colleagues via Slack. But basically, it's a completely free app to make it a little less stressful to be on all these meetings that we're on these days.
Mediocre. Are you being unnecessarily humble, or are you being accurately reflective of your achievements?
It depends on the lens. I'm a classic like founder programmer, which is like I can get features out quickly, or at least I could. I haven't shipped code to production in like 10 years, but I once upon a time could get features out pretty quickly. And they would work like 80% of the time, which I think is like the founder coder. It's like what we call the golden path. Like, we're bad at making things that work in all the various edge cases, and maybe bug quality is not our best strength, but we'll get a somewhat working version out pretty quickly.
Do you miss being the coder and doing all that kind of work, or do you prefer being CEO and a founder?
I mean, I used to. I think during the pandemic, I did some side projects where I wrote some of my own code for some apps that I wanted, and it was kind of fun. I think it's like a muscle that's like fun to keep at least somewhat in shape, right? It's fun to be able to like just solve your own problems at times. That said, I think once you have a really good team, my buddy Emmett, who is CEO of Twitch, used to say like having a good team around you is like wearing like an Iron Man suit. It's like I just think about a thing and it kind of happens, right? And so I do think we're at this point now with Fathom where we have a really fantastic like 10% engineering team, and they get things done faster than I ever would. And, so it does feel like that Iron Man suit, which I think is really great. But obviously when you're getting started, if you don't have that Iron Man suit, it's kind of nice to be able to, be self-sufficient, be able to like ship the feature if you need to yourself.
Are you a bit of a control freak? Do you like to be in control of everything? Or are you quite happy to delegate and pass out the work?
It depends on what phase the business is in. So I think when we started Fathom, and I think even the company before this that I started, in the beginning, I feel like you have to be a bit of a control freak, or really just more of like, it works better when it's all painted by a central, like one artist sort of thing, right? And so it's hard to delegate these things when everything is there's so few of the canvas painted in, right? To keep using this analogy. But I think as time goes on, then you have to switch and you have to start figuring out which things to delegate and in what order, right? So for me, like the product stuff, because that's my background, might be the last thing I delegate out. And the other Legos I give away first. So I think that's like the tough shift as an entrepreneur, because I think people that delegate too early, I haven't seen be that successful. So you have to the folks that are successful early on are kind of control freaks, but you'll hit this you'll hit the ceiling if you don't learn how to delegate, right? And delegate in the right order, sort of thing. So it's a bit of both.
So you've talked us a little bit about your history there. What actually inspired you to start Fathom, and what have you learned about how people use Zoom and taking notes?
We started Fathom right before the pandemic. And really, I was trying to solve my own problem. That's been kind of a theme for all of the startups that I've done. It's like, I have this problem. I go talk to rich folks. Turns out I'm the only one like that. And, obviously solving your own problems, I feel like is one of the greatest like entrepreneurial hacks, because then you get to be your own kind of like client, right? And your own best customer. But yeah, I was doing a bunch of video Zoom meetings myself. I was actually doing product research on a new product that I was working at building. And, it was one of those things where I was just on, I think like 15 Zoom calls a day type thing for like 6 weeks. And I was like, oh, well, this product that I'm researching is pretty good and getting some good reception. But you know what's really a pain in my ass? It's trying to talk to people and take notes at the same time. It's like having to clean up those notes right after the meeting ends because they're not really notes; they're more like mnemonics, right? Like, and trying to make. And then I come back to them 2 weeks later and be like, I don't remember which meeting this was, right? And I'd share it with my team, and they'd even understand even less. They had no context, right? It was a terrible game of telephone where it's like reading someone else's notes is really a very labor intensive, but also poor like artifact of what was actually said. And so that seemed like an obvious thing, right? You talk to folks and, at my last time I talked to my sales team. Yeah, they hate taking notes too. And I actually ran the sales team for a minute. So I remember reading their notes and I hated reading their notes because they were never the right fidelity that I wanted. And so, and so that kind of like, got me like, okay, this seems obvious at some point. We're going to have most of our meetings are going to be on a platform like Zoom. Most of our meetings will be recorded. Most of our meetings then will get transcribed. AI will get really good and it'll be able to take the notes for us. And everyone will welcome that because, like I said, no one likes to talk and type or write on a piece of paper at the same time, or almost no one. And so, I think that's basically how we got started, right? And we just kind of bet on a few trends. We bet that like transcription would get cheaper, and we bet that AI was going to get really good. And we said, hey, look, we're going to go position ourselves as the first people to like give this product. There were products like this before, but they were specifically targeted at salespeople only, and they were really expensive. And we said, gosh, we think this is not just a sales problem. We think this is a everyone on a meeting problem. And so we're going to target everyone and we're going to give the product away for free because we think by the time we get enough like usage for that to be painful, the price will be low enough that we can afford it. And we're very fortunate that turned out to be true because it was very expensive at the beginning and now it's very cheap. And that inflection happened right as we were really growing. So it worked out pretty well in our favor.
It was really serendipitous as well that you started this just before COVID, wasn't it? The timing was almost perfect. Did COVID help to publicize your product? Did COVID help to drive ingenuity? What was the effects of that on your business?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think most of the use cases we were targeting initially were already remote. Like most sales teams, most customer conversations outside of enterprise were already happening over Zoom. What has shifted was then every internal meeting was now happening over Zoom too. Right? No more in the office. So obviously that created a pretty big tailwind. It also meant that we really tightly aligned ourselves with Zoom. We were Zoom exclusive for many years before we kind of launched Teams and Meet support last year. And so we kind of, like talk about hitching your star to the right wagon there, right? Like they really took off, obviously. I think the most tangible impact is like my last company started off as a remote company 15 years ago. And then we built an office in San Francisco, another one in North Carolina. And then I feel like I spent half my life traveling to these offices. And so I was really excited. Like, I think I already wanted to kind of make a remote first company with Fathom. But then the pandemic gave me the oh, well, that's the only option on the table right now. So great. You don't have to think about it. So in some ways, I think the first, 6 months of Fathom were started in a cabin in Lake Tahoe. And I don't know, I feel like that was in some ways, the best impact for the pandemic for Fathom was it got rid of all the social distraction. I think one of the hardest parts about being a founder, I feel like there's two versions of entrepreneurship. There's everyone's right out of college, they're in their 20s, they've got no money, and so they don't do anything social. They just work 6.5 days a week because they win through horsepower. And then there's the older person, smarter but wiser, but you don't have 6.5 days to work. You got social commitments and whatnot. And you work smarter, not harder, or smarter and harder. But the hardest part about that is again, the social commitments, right? And COVID just made all of those go away. I also remember being in New York a couple years ago with a bunch of friends for a couple weeks. And I remember all of us being like, I'm not sure I would start a company here or invest in a company started in New York. There's just too much stuff to do. Right. And all the New Yorkers love to make fun of San Francisco because they're like, oh, it's not as good as New York. You're nightlife scene's not very good and your whatever scene's not very good. We're like, yeah, that's a feature, not a bug. This is a mining town where we're mining DAUs every day. If the nightlife is too good, we wouldn't get back in the mines every morning to go back to work sort of thing. So I think the biggest thing COVID did was just got rid of all social distraction. Well, you're not stuck at home. What better time to start a company and work your butt off?
A bit of bad news to help focus the mind. Mm-hmm. You have mentioned a couple of times your history with your other company as well. So let's just talk about that a little bit. So what's the biggest difference between your first startup and your second?
The first startup was the I'm in my 20s. I'm working 6.5 days a week. I'm writing the code myself. I'm falling asleep with the laptop every day, and I'm waking up and doing it again. And obviously with this one, it's quite different. We started with 4 of my best engineers I've ever worked with, right? And we raised money on day one sort of thing from my network because I'd been doing startups for 15 years. So I think it's a very different game. I liken it a lot to, have you ever played Minecraft?
I know of it. I haven't played it. I know
Okay, yeah,
of it.
everyone
My
knows of it.
nephew,
Yeah. So Minecraft is an interesting game because there's no way to win necessarily, right? It's kind of open-ended. There's no rules. There's no tutorial. You just get dropped in this world and kind of oh, this is cool. And you start looking around. That's very much, I feel like, your first startup where you're just I don't even know where to start. I'm not even sure what the rules of the game are. I'm not sure what I should be doing. And then your second startup is almost imagine you've played that game for 10,000 hours or watched people on YouTube play it for 10,000 hours. And, within the first day, you've built a castle and built a moat and you've done all these things, right? Because you figured out oh, it's actually not as open-ended. There's 5 winning strategies and here's what I go do. And I think that's the biggest difference between the first true startup you do and the second one is just this idea that all these things that felt like open-ended essay questions start now turning into multiple choice questions. And it just means your decision making gets so much faster and means your execution gets so much faster. And I think that's the biggest benefit, right? Whether it was marketing or engineering or sales, I now knew enough of all these disciplines to be dangerous and cool. Marketing, for example, would be oh, there's really 8 marketing channels and we can immediately rule out half of them don't make sense given the type of business we want to run. And then we're going to focus on these 2, right? And ignore everything else. And so I think that's the biggest difference is having the experience and also the internal confidence just to make these hard decisions and really focus down on here's how we're going to do this. And here's what we're going to say no to from day one.
So you mentioned networking there as well. How important has networking been in terms of your startups, and has its influence, is it dwindled when you have that experience that you have, or is it equally as important as it was ever?
I think it's always pretty important. If nothing else, it's where you're going to find your first team members, right? The people you're going to work with. So with UserVoice, my first company, I remember I met one of my co-founders on Craigslist and I met another one doing open source, but I had to get really scrappy about trying to find people to join my team because my network wasn't that big because I hadn't been in this arena for that long. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges. So, a lot of those folks had folks, I think my other friends went to schools where their college had more entrepreneurial folks. I don't think I met one guy who did a startup from my college, but I didn't meet him until 10 years later. It wasn't a thing that they did. I grew up in North Carolina. My friends that went to Stanford or MIT, they knew 20 people out of college they could do a startup with, sort of thing. So no matter what stage you're at, I think your network is pretty important just for that, right? It's just for figuring out who am I going to work with. I did a project in between, before UserVoice, and it was an experiment. It was I've done some open source projects, done some small startups on my own. And I was this startup, I'm just going to do myself. I'm not going to hire anyone. I'm just going to do everything. And it was kind of an experiment. And the experiment was how much can I get done just by myself? And the answer was a decent amount, but there's a pretty low ceiling on what you can do just by yourself, sort of thing. And so I think that's reflective of why having a network of people is pretty valuable.
And in terms of the learning experience, as one of the first apps on Zoom and first Zoom investments, what have you learned from that?
The only reason we were one of the first apps on the Zoom marketplace, so we started in fall of 2020. And I think 6 weeks after we started, Zoom announced they're building out this whole new app marketplace. And, it's basically a new app store, and new app stores don't come along every day. And so that's a super unique opportunity to get it on the ground floor. And they announced it was coming out in 3 months and they had 30 launch partners. They were all big names. And we were oh no, we want to be in that. Also, I don't think we can get the product done in 30 days, 3 months or whatnot. But we were fortunate in that kind of working through the network, I eventually figured out who was running this program. I just cold emailed that person and gave them the pitch of here's what we're building. I think it'd be a great fit for your marketplace. And thankfully they read cold emails from random entrepreneurs and we're yeah, sure, come on in, right? I think we also were fortunate in that the launch of that marketplace was actually delayed 6 months in the end, which at the time felt very painful because every month it was okay, we're going to launch. It's oh no, they delayed it another month. But in retrospect, it was really good because our product needed all 6 of those months to get to a place where it was just barely good enough, I think, to succeed. Right. So what I learned from that process, I mean, one thing I already knew, which is like getting on the ground floor of any sort of new distribution channel, super valuable. Do whatever it takes to get involved in that. Beg, borrow, cold email your way into it. And then I think the other part was like, the Zoom part was kind of frustrating and getting delayed. And then there's some other changes that happened on the way. And I think it was I got close to burning myself out trying to influence this larger company. And I was kind of like fighting the current, if you will, instead of like surfing it. And so I think one of the things I learned is like, use whatever agency you have to try to influence the things in your sphere of influence, but also recognize you can't influence everything. And just take what the universe offers you in that situation, right? Like I'm not going to, I'm running a 5-person startup. I'm not going to, Zoom's going to listen to me maybe, but like I don't really have any influence on their roadmap and stuff like that. So don't beat my head against the wall. Just ride that wave and take what comes, sort of thing. But yeah, and it was, again, in the end, it was all worth it because it was a fantastic partnership. It got us, our first, X thousand users, like, huge bootstrap. Like, honestly, it's obviously like the hardest problem in startups is how do you get the first 1,000 users? And we basically got gifted that on a silver platter. So, at least I don't remember all the strife I went through, but like, it feels like it was worth it at this point because it gave us that big leg up.
In terms of like starting the companies and funding, like how has seed stage funding like changed since you first raised money in 2008 with UserVoice to today with Fathom?
Very different. I mean, I think it's interesting. In 2008, there was so much what we call like asymmetry of information, right? The biggest challenge for investors was finding deals, like just what startups are even starting, right? And I always joke that like you don't have to be the best startup that's starting right now. You just got to be one of the top 3 that this investor is seeing this month, sort of thing, right? And they're only going to see 15 or 20, right? So it was like there's a bunch of, I feel like, smaller kind of pockets that you were competing in. I think over time, I mean, there's still some of that asymmetry, but a lot of it's gone away, right? Like, and you see this in the fact that when someone raises a round now, they often raise a ton of money because there's no asymmetry information. Everyone knows who's taking off and who has momentum, right? Like that spread so much more quickly than it did 15, 20 years ago. So like more money is basically flooding into a smaller group of startups than it used to. And obviously now, post 2022, the market correction, it's also very different. Like we were fortunate also that we started in what was the tail end and the exuberant tail end of like the longest bull market in software tech, right? Like started in early 2010s and ended in 2022. And we raised money at demo day with kind of vaporware, right? We're just going to go with this partnership, but we have this like alpha product. And I think we were very fortunate that like you couldn't run that playbook even today, probably, right? You would have to show more traction and more engagement. We're now back to this place that feels like a middle ground between where we started Fathom and where I started UserVoice 15 years ago, where it's a little more sober of a market. It's harder to get seed stage funding, but it's still largely out there and still way better than it was 15 years ago, sort of thing. It's not the insanity of 2020 and 2021, but if you're putting together a good product and you actually can show some engagement, which I think has always been the right metric at the seed stage, it's like you don't have to have 10,000 users. You need to have 100 people that just love it. If you have 100 people that really love your product, I'm confident you can, raise the amount of funding to get to the next milestone, sort of thing.
And since we're on the topic of challenges, like what are some of the challenges of customer-facing teams in a fully remote or hybrid environment?
I mean, ambient awareness, I think, is the biggest one, right? So like we work with a lot of sales teams and customer success teams, as you might imagine. Though Fathom's for everyone on a meeting, those folks are on the most meetings. They're on external meetings. That's usually the meetings everyone wants to hear, right? And so that's where Fathom really shines. And I think the thing we've heard from talking to people that run those teams is, pre-pandemic, sure, all these meetings were still happening on Zoom, but I could kind of overhear what's happening just by we're all sitting in the same room, right? You can kind of hear, I could just only hearing one half of the conversation, I can tell like, Tim is struggling with this question, or, Sally, that answer was a little rambly, or like, as a manager, you just kind of get the stuff ambiently. And now when you're fully remote, you don't get it at all. And so that's a lot of what we have another product on top of kind of the core Fathom product called Team Edition. And it's really targeted at those managers to help them understand, here's what's happening on your team in a remote environment, right? Where you don't hear them ambiently, sort of thing, and aren't sure. And I think that's what every manager right now is afraid of, is like, is my team saying things on meetings that I should know about, that speak to a lack of training, a lack of coaching, or just some other kind of like, misalignment, right? Maybe there's a new competitor that came out that I didn't even know about that should have been in the training, sort of thing. So we hear this a lot. I think that's one of the big things we're focused on that I think is pretty exciting, is we're starting to use AI to help us identify those moments, because no manager wants to listen to, or can even listen to, oh yeah, all 30 hours of meetings that my team had this week. So how do we use AI to like pull out those interesting moments and feed them to you, so that like you basically are just getting the greatest hits, if you will.
It's a fascinating perspective. Thank you for sharing that with us. And onto the final question before we unfortunately finish is, what advice would you give to aspiring entrepreneurs?
I think the advice I generally give is be a joiner. A lot of entrepreneurs, I fell into this trap early in my career too, which is that like, I think growing up, like I said, I grew up in North Carolina. Like I think I was probably one of the most entrepreneurial people I knew. I was like selling pictures to kids in like grade school and stuff like this, right? And I think this created this unhealthy habit for me, which is like I had this tendency to just like go it alone and try to get people to join my thing, right? And almost had this like ego or hubris of like, oh, I always had my own idea. I don't want to join someone else's. But like all the best things that have happened in my career happened generally when I like sucked up my ego and was like, oh, like, there's early on, I actually worked in a company in the first batch of Y Combinator with the guys who went on to co-found Twitch, Justin Kahn and Emmett Shear. And the reason I ended up working with them is they were building a thing that I wanted to build. Like they're building this like calendaring startup, and I wanted to build a calendaring startup. And at first I was bummed. I was like, damn, I wanted to build that. And then I was like, well, why don't I just work with them on it? And I like cold emailed them and started working with them. And that, honestly, the network I talked about earlier that's so important to my success came because of that connection, right? That got me out of North Carolina into Boston, and then into San Francisco, and into like this really rich vein of great entrepreneurs that were all going through this Y Combinator program. And all that happened because I was like, oh, and same thing, like the early founders of my last company were all folks I worked with on open source. And, in the open source thing, sometimes I was joining other people's projects, and sometimes I was encouraging them to join mine. And so, there's so little you can do by yourself. It's so important to build a team, and that doesn't mean you have to be at the head of that team necessarily, right? Like that's my best advice. Like be a joiner, look for like-minded folks, be willing to like jump on their idea instead of yours, right? I think that's where a lot of good things happen.
Incredible gold nugget advice. Thank you so much, Richard. Again, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. We really appreciate you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
That was Richard White, founder and CEO at Fathom.